the News Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris coming to you on this Wednesday, live and direct. Very interesting and important show this morning. You're going to be invited to join in the conversation. We're not only on the Plus, we're streaming live on Facebook this morning, so feel free to message any questions or comments on Facebook at newschannel5.com. We're going to be talking two parts of today's show. Later in the program, yes, Vice Mayor Jim Schulman will be here, and we will be discussing what passed late last night here in the city of Nashville, the property tax increase 34%, and it's going to be something that also involves more money for the police department, and that kind of leads us into what we're going to be talking about in the first portion of the show today. We're going to be talking about the concept of happening in cities across the country, including here in Nashville, where some are calling for the defunding of the police department, and I think there is an awful lot of confusion, questions, and concern about what that really means and can it be done. And to talk about it this morning, we are just very pleased to have with us one of the foremost experts, I think, on policing, community policing, and this concept as well. And he's joining us, a professor from Brooklyn College, and that is Professor Alex Vitale. Are you with us, sir? There you are. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning, Nick. You bet.
Well, it's a real pleasure. For this segment, we want to get to the heart of it right off the bat. If you can, you've been studying and writing about policing over the past quarter century. You've seen things evolve and change. Does it surprise you at all right now, in light of what we're going through in this country, that we have cities actually considering defunding police? And can you tell me what that means, what you see it meaning when they say defunding a police department?
Yeah, sure. This is not a new idea. It's something that's been percolating under the radar in a lot of ways, including in Nashville. The idea that cities have come to over-rely on policing as the only possible tool to use to produce public safety. And they've done that at the expense of all kinds of other possibilities. And what this movement is really calling for in cities all across the country is that we redistribute some of those resources from policing and local jails and youth lockups to services identified by communities that those communities think will actually do a better job of keeping them safe than just relying on armed police. And when we hear defund, it's not about, tomorrow there are no police. There's no world in which that's going to happen. It's about trying to develop these alternative infrastructures, things like community-based mental health services and community-based anti-violence efforts that folks think will actually enhance public safety.
Okay, so I'm glad you said that. There are some people that thought, well, who am I going to call if I've been robbed or someone's going to investigate a murder? Does it mean, however, then, though, that maybe the tasks that we see police dealing with these days, sometimes which are beyond their training, maybe it means that that will be given to some other type of expert or specialist as opposed to having police responding to everything? I personally think half the time it's a waste when you have a trained law enforcement officer responding to a fender bender. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, police are expensive. And there are a lot of cities now across the country who are moving towards trying to dial back the scope of things that police are relying on. And traffic enforcement is one of them. This is part of what's being proposed in Minneapolis, is that this be turned over to civilian workers to manage. We could create a kind of traffic force that doesn't use weapons and doesn't necessarily have arrest powers. We need to get the police out of the mental health business. And I think this is something that a lot of police agree with.
So does this mean then ultimately, if you defund, it means less money? It streamlines the department. Does that mean ultimately there may be fewer officers in the department, and meaning that they would just be the ones that remain focusing on the more serious crimes?
That's sort of what we're talking about. It would definitely mean a reduction in the headcount of officers as responsibilities are moved away from them. But, this isn't just about dialing off the soft things, the little things. I think we need to have some real rethink about whether or not armed police are the only possible solution to deal with things like youth violence and shootings. We've got a lot of data now that shows that there are community-based anti-violence initiatives out there that have had tremendous success in reducing this kind of violence.
So as you look around the country, it's been talked about here in Metro Nashville, but we've just seen that our city council approved a new budget, which includes more money for the police here. But I mean, how realistic is it that maybe in Minneapolis or someplace else, we are going to see this actually happen?
Well, it is happening. I mean, we've seen pretty clear commitments now in New York, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Baltimore, in Boston, to begin this process of creating alternative infrastructure so that we don't have to turn every problem under the sun over to the police to manage. And it's also happening in southern cities like Durham, and there's proposals in Dallas. And I think that this is going to be a national trend, that we're going to have to do a real rethink on this idea that only police can address these problems.
And it's interesting. A lot of the ideas we're just talking about seem to make sense. As you said, I like the idea of a traffic response team that deals with fender benders instead of a trained law enforcement officer. But I'm wondering how going in this direction may actually address some of the issues that many people are calling for with regard to the use of excessive force and racism among officers. How do you think by doing this, the defunding and separating of some of these tasks may actually help with those issues?
I definitely think so. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And we need to create an alternative structure for managing that. In a number of cities now, we're moving towards rebuilding community-based mental health care so that people don't have so many crises in the first place, and then putting in place a 24-hour crisis response capacity so that when people do have a crisis, the first person they see isn't someone with a gun.
Interesting. We were talking before the show, and I mentioned to you how the city of Nashville finally, after having purchased them and approved this a while back, is now just beginning to institute the police body cameras. And that happened here in large measure in response to some police-involved shootings here in the community. And citizens felt, wanting it, that it would make a difference. Is that something that you think can really help? And what are we hearing out there now with regard to the role that police body cameras can really play in some of this?
I think there's been a big shift in thinking on this subject. It's absolutely true that this was a primary demand of community groups in the wake of, the police killings over the last 6 years. But more recently, as we have more research and experience with body cameras being implemented around the country, there's a lot more skepticism about this. And I understand that many local activists in Nashville actually opposed new spending for body cameras there because the evidence shows it's not changing the way policing is done. We have high-quality studies in a couple of cities now that show that when police get body cameras, it doesn't reduce the level of violence, citizen complaints against the police, etc.
Yeah, it does seem as though it becomes a factor after the fact, if you will. I mean, thank goodness for some of the cell phone video that we've seen in many of these high-profile cases. Oftentimes we hear about police cameras being turned off and they don't have the video. But you do agree, though, that after the fact, thank goodness, if not police video, some of the cell phone video, because frankly, without it, many of these cases making headlines right now may never have happened.
One of the problems is that too often the control over the body camera footage is maintained by the police department. And when it shows them in a good light, they release it right away. And if it's more questionable, they sometimes sit on it. They deny families access to it. They edit the footage. And I think we need to tell people to continue taking those cell phones out and to independently document what the police are doing.
Let me ask you this final question. Just as you've studied policing for over 25 years, and there have been other incidents in the past that have created, an uproar and a few protests and maybe talks of change, and then things ultimately went back to being where they were. We still have protests that have been sustained now and continue to happen right now, but how confident are you, yes or no, that this is really going to be tangible change this time? Or if you and I were to sit down again and talk in 6 months, we're back at square one?
I think what's exciting about this is that this is really about the emergence of a broader kind of a new level of a racial justice movement, and that's why it's been sustained so long. And I think it is already producing tangible benefits, and I think it's going to continue to do so.
Professor Vitale, we thank you so much for joining us at this early hour today from there in Massachusetts. I guess you are this morning because you're on summer break. But thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can talk again at more length.
My pleasure, Nick.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Again, Professor Alex Vitale with Brooklyn College, one of the foremost experts, really, someone who studied policing for more than a quarter century and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project. He's going to be watching, of course, very closely what's happening across the country, including here in Nashville. And that was interesting. Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, we will be joined by a bleary-eyed Vice Mayor, Jim Schulman, who just a couple hours ago walked out of the courthouse after a very long, in fact, I think he said the longest city council meeting he's ever been a part of, where they did ultimately, yes, pass a property tax increase and what it means for the city and all of you. So if you have a question or comment, join us. We'll take your calls on the Plus. And I understand we were having a little bit of issue getting the streaming signal coming up online right now. If it's still not there, I apologize for that, but we'll take calls, and when that pops up, you'll see it on Facebook. We'll take a break and be back with the Vice Mayor right after this.